Okay, thanks for having me. And this is actually perfect for that I'm going after Max, because I think this might serve as a specific instantiation of some of the things that he was talking about in misalignment of objectives between different parties. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about some thoughts on online platforms and how they interact with human psychology, and then the need to take into account psychology when designing algorithms going forwards. I'm assuming this is okay. So this is joint work with John Kleinberg and Sendhil Mullainathan, who will be here later today, I assume. And it started with just general observations that I think we've all encountered, that something doesn't feel quite right about social media, that there's problems of addiction, overconsumption. Some people find that deleting your accounts can make you happier. There's tons of misinformation online. Generally, people don't seem to be thrilled with social media. And this seems to be somewhat at odds with the fact that there's a lot of money being poured into it, right? These companies are fabulously wealthy in this modern era. It seems like they should have the tools and the resources to make these things better. So what are the reasons behind the misalignment that we might be seeing between what the platforms are doing and whether we're actually benefiting from them? And there's lots of explanations you may have come across for these problems, right? Some people think that online problems are really just manifestations of offline problems. So to the extent that we see bullying offline, we will see bullying online, right? That's just human nature. Some of the explanations stem from nefarious actors, that there are bad actors online, they're trying to poison the well for everybody, and a lot of for instance, misinformation is willfully created. It's an intentional effort to make people unhappy or to promote different social goals. You also hear explanations that speak to psychological addiction, in a sense, that social media is like cigarettes. You shouldn't expect cigarettes to be good for people. You should treat them and regulate them as such. And the last explanation or class of explanations you might hear stems from profiteering and greed, that online platforms and social media companies seem to know what's going wrong, and they just choose not to fix it because they are making money from doing it. And this sort of speaks to some of the misalignment that Max was talking about. And I think all of these are in part valid explanations. None of them is complete, but also none of them is necessarily wrong. I'm going to suggest a slightly different class of explanations, though, one that I did not previously discuss here, and that is on internal conflicts. That not only do we seem to have conflicts between platforms and their users, we also seem to have conflicts between users and themselves. You can see tons of people online trying to figure out, how do I use this thing less, right? I know I'm wasting too much time on YouTube. I know I'm doom scrolling all the time. How do I fix that, right? And this seems to be a slightly different class of problems, because you would think that these are entirely within our control. We choose to open an app and how much time to spend on it and so on. And yet people seem to have self-control problems, right? And this is a growing line of observations that I've put some references at the bottom here, where people have realized that people are not just unhappy with the platforms, they're unhappy with their own behavior on those platforms, okay? And what I'm going to suggest to you is that there's an interaction between the way that we design algorithms for these online platforms and human behavior that's going underexplored. And so these internal conflicts are not about people fighting with each other. Of course, there's plenty of that online, but that's not the class of explanations I'm appealing to. It's not even necessarily about conflicts of interest, though I think we're going to get into that discussion as we go here. It's truly about people, in some sense, at war with themselves, right? People who have their better angels and their worst demons, and they're unable to sort out this internal conflict on their own. And what I'm going to suggest is that these are not just individual behavioral problems that particular people have, that these are sort of more foundational technical questions about how we build and design these platforms and the algorithms that are optimizing on top of them. And to do this, I'm going to tell you a story that thankfully I can tell you because Sendhil is not currently here, about Sendhil's self-control problems. So when Sendhil walks into a party at his friend's house, his friend is a very gracious host and puts a bowl of chips on the table. And Sendhil sits down in front of that bowl of chips and starts eating them one after another. And pretty quickly that bowl of chips is over. Right? Sendhil has, as we said, self-control problems. But it would be bad enough if it just ended there. But Sendhil also has a very gracious host who walks by and sees, wow, this bowl of chips is empty. As a good host, what is your immediate reaction to seeing that bowl of chips being empty? Well, the host refills the bowl of chips. And now we are back to square one with Sendhil, coffee table, bowl full of chips, and the process repeats itself, right? And at the end of the day, this was initially about me, but because Sendel isn't here, maybe this is the wrong graphic frame. This is now applying to me. I feel like if I were in this situation, I would feel that I had eaten too much. But fundamentally, nobody had forced any consumption of chips, right? Everything was voluntary here. So what were the problems? Clearly, there was a self-control problem, right? That was what we started with. But there was a secondary problem on top of that that exacerbated the initial self-control problem, and that was that the host inferred preferences from behavior, right? And this is a clear problem that we see that because the preferences in this case were inconsistent. In the moment, you wanted to be eating chips, but after the fact, you wish you hadn't. So your preferences aren't stable over time, but somehow your host is inferring your preferences as if they were. This is often known in the economics literature as a revealed preference assumption, that you don't have to ask somebody what they want, you can just observe what they do and use that to infer what they want. Right? This is sort of the core of what online platforms do. They look at your past activity, maybe somebody's Netflix browsing history. They don't spend a lot of time asking you what you actually want to watch. Most of your Netflix recommendations are just generated by, well, what did you watch? Let me show you more of that stuff, right? And baked into all of this is an assumption that you spent your time watching the things that you actually wanted to watch, right? That your actions revealed your true preferences. And we should interrogate, is this a good assumption? Is this a good place to be resting all of our online platform content distribution? Now, you could argue the opposite, though. You could say, well, what you're saying, Manish, is that you should just be ignoring behavior that is not telling us anything interesting about what people want. But if I told you that story about salad instead of chips, you might have felt quite differently, right? Sendel sits down, sees a bowl of salad, starts eating it, host comes by, sees an empty bowl, and refills it. Somehow we don't feel quite so bad about the salad version of the story than the chips version. Now, why? Because we have a qualitative understanding about the differences between chips and salad. We think that chips might be more addictive, or you might suffer from more self-control problems. Maybe we don't think that people have significant self-control problems with respect to salad. So why am I drawing this distinction? It seems like the revealed preference assumption exists for a reason, right? It seems to work pretty well in practice. People, my Netflix recommendations are actually pretty good. I don't have too much of a problem with it. So the question, though, is what do we do in the cases where it doesn't work? Or how could we understand places where the revealed preference assumption is a good one and distinguish it from cases where it is not a good assumption? And how could we then use that to design platforms accordingly, right? I want to go back to an analogy that we came across earlier, that social media was like cigarettes in some sense. And I think that analogy ends up being slightly misleading. I think a slightly more comprehensive analogy is that social media is like a grocery store. You can find cigarettes there, you can also find vegetables there, you can find whatever you want. But with a grocery store, the person running the grocery store gets to look at the nutrition facts on the things that they're selling and decide, should I be selling this thing? Should I put it right by the checkout counter where everybody's going to see it? Should I hide it in the back of the store? And make sort of content delivery decisions based on a qualitative understanding of that content. Social media platforms are like they're running a grocery store with no understanding of what they're selling and no nutrition facts to guide them. And they're basically saying, whatever people buy lots of, we're going to put that right at the front of the store and make it easier and easier to buy. That's going to end up with a grocery store that sells cigarettes and cough syrup right at the front, right? This is sort of the world that we're headed towards because we lack this qualitative understanding. But that's not to say everything at the grocery store is cigarettes. It is that the way that you manage that grocery store and the way that you choose to optimize it is going to change the type of store that you get. The way that we're going to try to approach this from a modeling perspective and try to derive some insight is to start with some ideas from the behavioral economics and psychology literatures. These are sort of multiple self or two self models of psychology that help explain how we make the decisions that we make. And abstracting away from the exact mechanisms underlying them, there's an emerging theme that you get from this literature, which is that we have sort of at least two distinct decision-making processes. One which I'll refer to as System 1, which is very impulsive and myopic, makes short-term decisions, doesn't really think too hard about the decisions that it's making. And that's often set up in contrast to System 2, which makes more forward-looking and thoughtful decisions, right? More deliberative, actually reasoning about the long-term impacts. Okay? And so in a person that has these multiple selves, how should we really think about their preferences? For the purpose of this talk, I'm going to think of System 2 as your true preferences. We can get into a little bit of a debate about whether that's really the right view of the way that we behave. But it's useful to set that up as a contrast between system 1 and system 2 to see what we can get out of it, and especially as it pertains to social media. There's a few empirical studies that I think are super instructive in trying to definitely building my intuition for these, and hopefully building yours. One was looking at the groceries that people tend to order. What you can see is if you order groceries for a date that is very close to today, maybe a few hours today or tomorrow, you tend to buy things that you want, things like ice cream and soda and stuff like that. But if you're buying groceries farther into the future, you actually tend to engage more of your system 2 thinking and buy the things that you really should be buying for your household. So this is like things like vegetables, rice, and so on. So this is setting up this distinction between the things that you want and the things that you actually think that you should have. You get similar payoff when you look at, this was in 2009 when movie consumption was largely ordering DVDs online. And you get these interesting effects where people would order they would order, let's say, a documentary, and then they'd order an action movie. But then they'd return the action movie before the documentary, which sort of suggests that given the choice between these two, they were consistently choosing the want good, right, the action movie, as opposed to the should good, which was the documentary or award-winning film. And so what they were showing is that you can see that when people make plans to watch a movie, they'll make plans to watch the thing that they think they should watch. But when it comes time to actually sit down and watch the movie, they'll watch the thing that's thrilling or entertaining in the moment. So there really is good empirical evidence over the years for this want versus should in our consumption. Now, so far we've been talking about food and DVDs and so on. How does this really pertain to online platforms and social media? I think there's a lot of similarities between content consumption and a lot of the goods that we've been talking about. I will say that social media and online platforms impose a number of new challenges that I think are unlike what we've seen before. One is that the sea of available content online is just much broader than anything we've seen before for offline goods, right? It's sort of as if you could bioengineer chips to be the most engaging as possible to a consumer. The other thing I'll say is online platforms have a lot of latitude to make design decisions. Essentially, they get to design the party layout, and they put a bowl of chips on every table so it's impossible to miss them as you walk by. So in some sense, these design decisions interact with content delivery decisions. And we're going to talk a little bit about how we can think about that interaction as we go. The thing that I'm going to appeal to, which again goes back to Max's talk, is what are they actually optimizing for? What are online platforms actually optimizing for? And as Max said, it's often not totally clear from the outside exactly what combination of behaviors they're looking at, but the general framework that they use is often known as engagement optimization. They take particular behaviors, like clicks, watch time, things like that, predict how much you will do them, and then choose the content that maximizes a combination of clicks and likes and watches and so on. Okay? And the thing that I want to think about here is what happens when some of those behaviors that they're optimizing for and observing are generated by system 1, perhaps a majority of your behaviors, and only a few of them are generated by system 2. Right? Now, if those are inconsistent with each other and you're learning some combination of them, what sort of combination will that look like, and how will that influence the decisions that you make? So in this work, what I'm going to talk a little bit about, and probably skip through most of the technical details, is we develop a theoretical model of behavior that builds on these system 1, system 2 ideas, and try to analyze engagement optimization in this model. Right? So if you behave through some combination of system 1 and system 2, and a platform simply maximizes your engagement in some sense, what are they actually going to end up learning? And what pops out of this is a very basic tension that arises between the utility of the consumer, or how happy you are with the platform, and your engagement, how long you appear to be engaged on the platform, how much time you spend, how much you interact with it. And one question that you might have, or that a platform might have, is can you even tell whether you are serving a consumer chips or salads simply from their behavior, right? If you are delivering some content to them, they're consuming lots of it, can you tell if that's because they are really happy, they think this is good for them, they really want to be there, or because they're just sort of mindlessly scrolling, right? From an observational perspective, what happens if you can't really tell the difference between those? Without getting into the technical details, but here's the sort of broad flavor of results we can get here, and then we can talk a little bit about how you might try to operationalize some of these insights. The first thing that you sort of immediately notice from trying to think about this is that maximizing engagement can fail to maximize utility. Right? what actually makes people happy is quite different from what makes them stay for a long time on the platform. Now, this is sort of almost by way that we set the model up. It turns out that there are some specific reasons, though, and identifiable reasons why this might be the case. And I can talk a little bit about what those reasons might be if you have questions. But the other thing that pops out of it is there actually are reasonable conditions under which engagement is a good proxy for utility. And in some sense, that is the regime that online platforms are hoping to operate in. If engagement is a good proxy for utility, if what makes people stay on the platform also makes people happy, then you don't have a conflict of interest. You don't even have an observational problem, because you actually have all the information you need to make people happy. Just make them stay on the platform for a long time. And if that happens to be a good proxy for their utility, then everybody is happy. Okay? So there are specific conditions under which that is the case. You can think of this as, some videos on YouTube are educational science videos. And we might not think of big system 1, system 2 conflicts there. Right? You might think that people are watching YouTube or Khan Academy videos because they're actually deriving value out of them, not because they are mindlessly, endlessly watching Khan Academy videos on loop. Now, of course, the real question is, how would you know the difference between these cases? How would you know whether you are in the junk food regime or the salad regime? And the answer is, generally from behavioral, just strictly behavioral and observational data, it's actually kind of hard to do this. But if we're smart about how we use auxiliary information, we might actually be able to tell the difference between junk food and salad, right? For instance, most platforms run small numbers of user surveys just to get, YouTube will pop up a survey every once in a while saying, how happy were you with your past section? How much did you enjoy watching this video? Generally, that volume of data is not enough to directly optimize on. So it's not good enough to make actual predictions about this person will truly be happy with this particular video. But it might be enough to do this more classification task of saying, here's the stuff where there's a high correlation between session length and utility. Here's the space where there is a negative correlation between session length and utility, where the longer that people are staying on the platform, the less happy they are. If we can do that classification task with smaller amounts of data, maybe we can still distinguish between the junk food regime and the salad regime. And the last thing that this speaks to, which I want to talk about a little bit, is the interaction between content decisions and design decisions. So for instance, you might think of design decisions like turning on autoplay on YouTube as directly influencing the relationship between system 1 and system 2. Right? If you make it easier to mindlessly scroll and make it harder to leave the platform, you are shifting more weight from system 1 to system 2. Now, you might think that this has a very predictable effect, that people stay on the platform for longer if you turn on autoplay. That's true. But there actually might be heterogeneity across content, where for Khan Academy videos, maybe turning on autoplay actually doesn't make a huge difference because people weren't mindlessly engaged in the first place. But for celebrity gossip videos or something like that, you actually might see a larger effect of turning on autoplay because it allows people system 1 to take over even more. So using that heterogeneity, we might actually be able to exploit these design decisions to actually learn about the sort of nutrition facts that we should have about the content that we're delivering. The last thing I want to briefly discuss here before wrapping up is just trying to think a little bit more broadly about how to think about our behavioral biases and our psychology in the context of algorithms. And this is some joint work with John, Jens, and Sendel. I want to put to you that if we just take a step back, what went wrong when we were talking about engagement optimization here? Why did engagement optimization fail to achieve our ends? Well, the process that we were using was something like the following. We took data on people's behavior, we fed it into an algorithm, and we used it to take action in the world, content delivery decisions. And what we said was, before that, there was actually a sort of implicit intermediary step. That before we actually took these actions, we're implicitly making inferences about people's preferences. Right? We're trying to learn what people like, trying to learn what people actually want. And so this is what the picture of running algorithms on behavioral data looks like. But if you talk to a behavioral scientist, they think of this picture in the other direction. Right? They start with people's preferences, and they build a user model. And from that user model, you can make predictions about data or about people's behavior. Right? And this sort of closed loop means that what we should look for is alignment between the algorithms that we build and user models that we think are reasonable. To the extent that our algorithms match up in some sense with our user models, then it makes sense to use algorithms on that data. But if there's a mismatch between our user models, the way that we think people actually behave, and our algorithms, which are making inferences about people's preferences based on their behavior, we're going to start to see some problems. And so what we should be looking for is these mismatches, right? Where our understanding of human behavior is at odds with the algorithms that we have been deploying based on that behavior. And actually, there's tons of examples, especially in the recent literature, on those particular mismatches, what we've seen. For instance, there's a recent paper from this year looking at how people's preferences for people who look like them are not actually reflected in their behavior, right? Even if you don't have strong preferences towards your sort of in-group biases, it turns out this is reflected in your more automatic behaviors. And now if you start to learn models on top of those automatic behaviors, you end up reflecting those types of in-group biases. So there's a number of places where actually our behaviors deviate from what we sort of idealize them when we build our algorithms. It's sort of reminiscent of an early divide between rational models of people versus behavioral economics. And so what we're hoping for is a sort of mirror version of that in the algorithms that we deploy. So the takeaways here, if I had to say it in one slide, is something like algorithms increasingly interact with human psychology. A misspecification or misunderstanding of that human psychology can lead to negative social phenomena. And in order to build responsible algorithms and responsible computing, we need a better understanding of that psychology to produce algorithms that then work better for people. Thanks for your time. Happy to take questions.
It's very interesting. We have time for one question, and then there's going to be a break. And we will be back and starting sharp at 11 o'clock. There is coffee and lots of it outside, but there's a question.
Thank you. It was a very interesting talk, and I think the idea of trying to optimize these algorithms or models is, of course, important. But one thing to consider is that there are times when it maybe is a good idea not to do that, to have a curated set of things that are being presented to lots of people, like a museum exhibit does that.
Yeah, absolutely. And so I think my response to that is, in general, yes. When it comes to online platforms, there's a sense in which the scale is too vast to rely on hand curation all the time. And in some sense, we need to be able to draw inferences from data somehow. Now, whether that is algorithmically or you have people reviewing data, look at the trending things and decide what to feature on a particular page, that still requires drawing inferences about people's preferences from behavioral data. Now, to the extent that we can better understand how human behavior generates, or how people's preferences actually generate the behavior that we see, this can apply to humans making better decisions about curation, not simply algorithmic decisions. So I don't see a sharp divide between those. I see it as we have tons of data on what people are doing. In some way, we have to help people figure out what they want, or curate things for them because there's just too much stuff out there. And that curation process requires drawing inferences that need to be behaviorally sensitive or psychologically sensitive in some way, whether it is done algorithmically or by human curators. Thanks for the question.
Speakers.